Hello everyone, welcome to Discuss and Deliberate, a StudyIQ exclusive, comprising a series of interviews, and I am your host Vignesh Karthik. I am a PhD student at King's College London, and we at StudyIQ have curated this series as a dialogue between thought leaders and the aspirational youth of the nation who seek to contribute to the idea of and the building of India. Today, we are delighted to have with us Manu Pillai, a reputed young historian, to talk about the syncretic past of India, one that was marked by peaceful and harmonious coexistence. Namaskaram and welcome, Manu.
Thank you for having me, Vignesh. Looking forward to the conversation.
So, Manu is the author of the award-winning The Ivory Throne, Chronicles of House of Travancore, Rebel Sultans, The Deccan, from Khilji to Shivaji, and most recently, The Courtesan, The Mahatma, and The Italian Brahmin, Tales from the Indian History. Formerly Chief of Staff to Dr. Shashi Tharoor, MP, he has in the past worked at the House of Lords in Britain with Lord Karan Bilimoria and with the BBC on the Incarnations History series, assisting Dr. Sunil Khilnani. Written over 6 years and researched in 3 continents, Manu's first book, The Ivory Throne, won the 2016 Tata Prize for the best first work of non-fiction and the 2017 Sahitya Academy Yuva Puraskar. Manu is also text contributor to Serena Chopra's Bhutan Ecos, and for 3 years wrote a weekly column for the Mint launch. His other writings have appeared in The Hindu, The Open Magazine, The Times of India, Hindustan Times, The New Statesman, and other publications. Manu is an alumnus of Fergusson College, Pune, and currently enrolled as a PhD candidate at the King's College London. At a personal level, Manu and I have been colleagues, friends, and even have a senior-junior equation with respect to King's College. So before we go into the questions, may I request you, Manu, to start with your introductory comments on the importance of fostering coexistence today and the need to revisit India's syncretic past to do so?
Firstly, I should tell everybody that you are now the senior as opposed to me, because I had to take a gap in the middle. So now you've shot off ahead of me. So the senior-junior relationship has been reversed. Now coming to your question, there are 2 aspects to it, right? In the present, why do we need religious tolerance? It's obvious to all. Because if we are in a diverse, pluralistic society with a plural history, there's no single history to India. There are multiple histories with multiple layers, some confined to specific geographies, some that are, subcontinental in their reach, some that today sit even in foreign countries. For example, if you're talking about the evolution of the Hindu religion, one of the greatest temple complexes of the Hindu religion sits in what is now Cambodia, not even in India. So, it really keeps moving about a lot. But if you're talking specifically about the present, we need it simply because we are a diverse society. For any diverse democracy to continue in this shape, I think everybody has to be taken on board. You can't, bring about cleavages and think that they will remain in your control. The more you divide, the more it also, sort of gets out of your hand, and you can never predict what will happen in future. Which is why in an essay I wrote, and which was published in the India Forum last Independence year, one of the arguments was precisely this, that, our freedom fighters, they had the maturity to realize that this unity in diversity isn't just a slogan. It actually means something. It's a way to keep everybody together on the bus, because otherwise, if you start promoting one over the other, everybody will find enough reasons to sort of tear things apart. So it's a wise decision, politically speaking. In a historical sense, it's not as though the past was some kind of paradise where everybody was happily getting along. Religion was used for political purposes also. But the difference is our current belief that all of past politics, say 500 years ago, was defined by religion. That is what is incorrect. Religion was merely one of many factors that were in play. Economics would be a factor. Sometimes genealogy would be a factor. Sometimes, religion would be used and sometimes it would be discarded. All kinds of other factors existed. Geography, region, everything played into, why a particular ruler or why a historical figure acted a way as opposed to, another way. Now, one example, for example, is this whole story of the Mughal Emperor Babur. People often think of him as this, invader who came in and he brought about this grand Islamic onslaught into India. It's actually interesting to look at his own antecedents before he came to India. There was actually a time when he was still outside India and he was really at his lowest point and he needed support from the Shah of Iran. What did he do? He actually started practicing Shia Islam because he knew that that is what the Shah practiced. And as soon as he managed to get what he wanted with the Shah's support, he went back to being a Sunni Muslim. When he came to India, not once, and he's left, of course, his memoirs, not once did he actually talk in a language that you can call jihadist, till he finally faced an almost like make or break kind of a battle against the Rajputs. At that point, half of his governors had gone back to Afghanistan. He was very demoralized. His troops had already suffered a lot of defeats. That is where he uses religion as a sort of final trump card in order to get his troops' morale up. So religion is the sort of commodity that is used by politicians back then, just as politicians today do it, when they need it, depending on what proportion they need it in. It is not a constant. You know, our ancestors did not wake up every morning thinking only about religious things, thinking only through a religious prism, thinking, oh, that person's not from my religion, therefore he's my enemy. It's simply not humanly possible. Is it possible for us to do that? No. When you live in a society that is diverse, where people don't look like you, multiple castes exist, not everybody dresses like you, your supplier of groceries belongs to one caste, somebody else, the cleaner of your bathroom belongs to another caste. Everything is different. So even if you do construct things in a religious sense, you can't live your life on the basis of that. That is the overall sort of historical position. To reiterate, it doesn't mean religion did not matter. Back in the day also, religion did have value. Kings especially articulated their dynastic self-image in religious vocabulary. But we as students of history should not fall into the trap of thinking that their formal proclamations and their formal self-image was the only thing to them. It was one of many facets.
In fact, I'd like to sort of, just because you raised you brought up your article from the India Forum, which I had already had a question on, which is, again, I'd like to sort of read out Gandhi's quote from that article, which goes this way. Hindustan belongs to all those who are born and bred here and who have no other country to look to. Therefore, it belongs to Parsis, Beni Israels, to Indian Christians, Muslims, and to the other non-Hindus as much as to the Hindus. Free India will not be a Hindu Raj. It will be an Indian Raj based not on the majority of any religious sect or community, but on the representatives of the whole people without distinction of religion. In fact, what is the temper that one needs to hold to reap such lessons from the Indian history like Gandhi did, as against the people who promote exceptionalism, quoting from the same history or, the history again?
I mean, frankly, if you selectively quote anything, you can come up with all kinds of wild arguments. But let's just take a very recent example, right? Diwali has just passed a couple of days ago, and my grandmother's here with me, and I asked her what their childhood Diwali was like in Kerala, and it was a very simple answer. All they did was there was this very extensive oil bath, and there was a lighting of lamps in the evening. Whereas if you ask a North Indian Diwalis have always been much grander, which is to say that even within this umbrella term that we call the Hindu religion or the Hindu community, there are multiple Hinduisms that exist. So the Hinduism you see in Kerala is not the Hinduism you will see in Manipur. The Islam you see in Kashmir is not the Islam you will see in Kerala. There are again differences even in that one religion, which technically has one book and one set of rules, but in cultural practice it takes different regional shapes. And essentially that is what Gandhi and his entire generation of freedom fighters, they were all aware of that. They were all aware that what they were trying to construct was in many ways against the odds. Everything, even you read something like the Linguistic Commission's report, and there's this interesting quote where they say, we were alarmed at how thin the ice was on which we were skating. Because each state, one of the reasons the Congress party after independence did not want linguistic states is because they realized that language was a strong glue in its own right. And there was the fear that India might get divided between different cultures. Technically, a lot of this falls in the Hindu bracket. But as I said, a Malayali has very little in common with a Punjabi. Why should they think of themselves as one nation? It was in order to surmount that the founders decided, look, we have to think of a bigger idea. We have to think of something that is grander. They had a kind of vision that was much vaster. It was much bolder in many ways. It would have been very easy even then for them to go down a majoritarian path. It would have been the easiest thing to do because, it was a low-hanging fruit kind of thing. But they did not want to do it. There were ideals. They had seen what, fascism could do, for example. They had suffered through 2 world wars, not one. They had seen what imperialism could do. They had drawn lessons of what we now call history, but for them that was lived experience. They had actually seen what selective reading, ultra nationalism, what hyper patriotic attitudes could do to a people. It pushed people into situations which they did not want their country to have to confront. Which is why they had this idea that things need to be much broader. We have to be able to think beyond limitations and think of all of these diversities not as a weakness. One of the arguments majoritarian ideologies have is that this is weakness. If you don't standardize, if you don't homogenize, we are weak. We can be taken advantage of by other people. The country will split up. They actually thought of it in a slightly different tone, where they said, actually, this is not weakness. Think of it as a strength. So long as you create ground rules by which all this diversity can be managed, nothing to fear, because we are still all Indians. It doesn't matter what language you speak or what color your skin is or what religion you practice. We've all come on board this idea of India, that now what people call a cliched term, the idea of India, but that idea mattered. It was not just thing they pulled out of thin air. It came out of lived experience. It came out of seeing what a lack of an idea or a limited idea, or worse, a sort of misunderstood idea could do to entire nations.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. And now I'd like to sort of move to one of the comments that your book Rebel Sultans received. In fact, from Dr. Sunil Khilnani, who you'd worked before, and he's been a professor. In fact, he says that your book, The Rebel Sultans, returns Deccan to the center of our attention, where it belongs. Can you shed some light on the importance of the Deccan, and more importantly, medieval India, that has a checkered reputation, at least in our minds today?
The whole purpose was to sort of remove a topic that is in the footnotes and bring it to the mainstream for 2 reasons. One, because the story deserves to be told in its own right. Deccan history is fascinating. And I was just surprised that there aren't enough readable popular narratives about it. There is some academic work, but again, a very small fraction if you compare it to the Mughals, for example. So I just wanted to tell that story for its own sort of richness and interesting quality. But the other thing was also that when we think of India, we don't realize exactly how every corner, every nook has some story or the other. And there is such a wealth of information in this country. There's such a wealth of material that we can actually learn so much from. And it's really a tragedy that we aren't making the effort, or we aren't actually talking as much about these stories. Now, with the Deccan, for example, my original argument was that when people talk of the Deccan, it's either Mughals invaded it or the Marathas fought back. But the difference is that this only happened in the late, the Mughal Aurangzeb Maratha, conflict started happening in the late 17th century. In the 1670s onwards is where it picks up. But in reality, where are the centuries before? Who was in control of the land before? And that sort of sent me down this very interesting rabbit hole, where I found that, again, it challenges a lot of our notions, especially about identity, right? For example, Bijapur was ruled by the Adil Shahs, and the Adil Shahi dynasty was founded by a Persian. He claimed to be a Persian. Some say he was a Georgian. Some say he was an Iraqi. Point is, he was a foreigner who came out of the West, settled down here as a warrior, as a fighter for the Bahmani sultans who ruled before. He ended up marrying a Maratha woman, so a Hindu Maratha lady, a lot like Akbar married the Rajputs in the north. So the Adil Shahi dynasty from day one was a mixture of this Persian, Shia, and some of them were Sunnis also, but Persian Muslim blood with this Hindu Maratha blood. And you find that different Adil Shahs play up different elements of their religious identity. So the second Adil Shah was hyper-Persian. He just wanted to copy everything that was being done in Persia. And he sort of created a miniature Persia in his court in Bijapur here in South India. Ibrahim Adil Shah II, on the other hand, didn't care very much about Persian. An ambassador from the Mughals came to see him, and he was horrified to find that the man didn't even speak Persian properly. He preferred Marathi. He preferred his sort of matrilineal sort of Hindu, heritage. He was a Sunni Muslim, Ibrahim Adil Shah II, but he also called himself son of Saraswati and Ganapati because he venerated the goddess Saraswati as well as Ganapati. He created art that shows Saraswati in a very distinct way, where if you look at it at one glance, you'll think it's a Muslim princess. But in reality, if you look closely, it's got the conch, the veena, every symbol of Saraswati is in that painting. When he imagined his Saraswati, he imagined her in an Islamic style. And it was perfectly normal in his day. Even in one of his more better known writings, before he pays homage to the Prophet Muhammad, he actually venerates Saraswati. She's the one who receives first remarks from the king in that creative work. So you also have these interesting characters who in many ways challenge our notion of these religious binaries where people were constantly either Muslim or Hindu. Here you have a king who not only in his blood but also in his attitude is trying to marry his Sunni Islam with Hindu deities. Similarly, there was a descendant of the Bahmani sultans whose greatest desire, and he had studied Vedic thought and so on, and he had become a sannyasi and a poet, and his greatest desire was to be recognized as a sort of Hindu person. And the Brahmins would not allow him to get a punul and a sacred thread and sort of reincarnate him. His name was Muntoji Bahmani, and he wanted to be called Mrityunjaya, but they wouldn't allow it. So he died simply as Muntoji Bahmani. Think of somebody like Chhatrapati Shivaji. If you go to close to Ellora, there are the old samadhis of his grandfather, Maloji Bhosle. Samadhis are basically where Hindus are cremated, and because it's an important person, they construct a structure there to commemorate the person. There's actually been a scholar who looked at those buildings and referred to them as tombs. And it wasn't, I forgive that man's mistake for the simple reason that if you look at that building at one glance, Shivaji's own grandfather's samadhi, it looks like an Islamic tomb. Because the architecture at that time had drawn a lot from Persia and Persianate and Islamic styles. So even Hindus were building palaces and their domes, etc., in a very Islamic form. If you go to Vijayanagara, which is called this great Hindu empire, you'll find a lot of Islamic influence in the architecture there. You'll find Islamic influence and Persianate influence even in their clothes. This penetrated all the way to South India in the late 18th century, in the 18th century, so 1780s. There was actually a Malayali king, and there was a Carmelite father who came to see him with a letter from the Pope. And this man was stunned because this Malayali king sitting in Kerala, firstly in Darbar, he wore Persian robes. But when he opened his mouth to speak to the father, he spoke in English. Now think of it, this man is called Padmanabha Dasa because his family is devoted to Padmanabha Swami, which is a Hindu temple. He's dressed in Persian robes because the diplomatic world around him after the Mughals came had been Persianized in many ways. So formal court attire was Persian attire. Similar with Marathas and if you look at Maratha kings also, very Persian clothes. He had already learned the English language in the late 18th century, so he was able to speak in the language of a colonial company as well because he knew this company is advancing and it's starting to rise. People's identities are not just one narrow box. People learn to negotiate all kinds of different things, and it was perfectly normal. Just as another example I've started developing these days is you and I'm wearing a t-shirt, you're wearing a shirt, technically Western clothes. It's almost as though 500 years from now, somebody looks at our clothes and assumes that we are Westerners, but we're not. We are Indians, we have Indian thought, you have a Tamil thing, I have a Malayalam thing, but we're also comfortable wearing Western clothes. It doesn't take away our Indianness simply because there are certain superficialities. Identity is always a very complex subject. It's not an either or, it's often an and between things.
In fact, thank you very much for bringing that nuance into the idea of identity. In fact, I've been trying to sort of grapple with it a lot in my writings as well. On that note, I'd like to sort of move to another character in your book, who is Malik Kafur, again, who features in your book as a very notorious figure at times. Which on many counts he was also, because he was following the rules or the orders of his king. But in spite of the trouble he caused and his, again, quote unquote Islam identity, the Deccan seems to have accommodated Islam and its many variants in a sort of a natural manner. You've just spoken about a few examples, but then can you also tell us about how this happened, how this syncretic approach actually came about to be the process?
It was inevitable. Now, when you're talking about a Malik Kafur, of course, there's no getting. That's why in this discussion on syncretism, we shouldn't forget that conquest is always painful. Conquest is always violent. Violence was the norm till about 150 years ago. Even the British, in the 1860s, which is not very long ago, and when they had already pretended that they were here to civilize Indians and all that, one of their favorite forms of punishments to deal with mutineers and seditionists, etc., of that time, and people who sort of tried to revolt against them, was to tie them up to a cannon and blow them out. So your flesh is sort of spread all over the countryside and you're blown to bits because they thought it would send the right kind of message. That kind of violence was extremely closely wedded to power of any kind. Now, if you're going to talk conquest, conquest is often when religious ideology is emphasized. Conquest is often when you know you're going into someone else's territory. You know you're going into somebody else's culture. You know you're going into gain material riches, gain territory for very earthly things. So in order to sort of package it in a slightly more noble way, you make it a religious war. And this you see with Hindu kings as well as Muslim kings. It's not particular to one religion. But sometimes, now, instead of Kafur, the better example is Tipu Sultan, really. Because I'm a Malayali, right? So in Kerala, when you talk about Tipu Sultan, he is cast always as the invader. And it's true, when he came to Malabar, and he was very violent. It was quite brutal for many people. There's this one family called the Parappanad Rajas, of which I think 11 members were forcefully converted. And they eventually came back to live there, but they had been thrown out of their community and caste. There are horror stories around Tipu Sultan. But that is Tipu Sultan the Conqueror. That is Tipu Sultan who says, I will tie my horse to the flagstaff of the Padmanabha Swami temple, because he knows that the king of Travancore is closely connected to the Padmanabha Swami temple. So his way of attacking the king's legitimacy is to say, I will destroy your temple. If he had got to Trivandrum, he may well have desecrated the temple as well. No surprises there, because he was a conqueror. But you look at Tipu in the same period in his settled territories in Mysore, completely different avatar. The same man who is a conqueror using ultra-religious language in a place where he's an invader, in his settled territories, the same man is sending Shivalingams to the Sringeri Matha. Now, what is interesting is in Kerala, he's saying, you idolaters, I'm going to destroy your temples. Here, he himself is sending Shivalingas to a Hindu, sacerdotal figure. Similarly, and there's this wonderful book by Caleb Simmons, which I read recently, and I had a podcast with Caleb just a few days ago. And it's extraordinary, the kind of details you get out of it. For example, Tipu, in his letters to the Sringeri Matha's head, actually talks of protecting dharma. He talks about how in this Kali Yuga, there's so much adharma and forms of adharma have come. And who are these, manifestations of Kali Yuga he's talking about? The Marathas. So when he's talking about Marathas who are trying to attack him, he assumes the position of protector of dharma. He assumes to protect the whole Hindu dharma characteristic. He's asking the Sringeri Matha to perform pujas for him. He's sending them idols and Shivalingas. He's funding religious ceremonies of a Hindu type. And he's referring to the Hindu Marathas as agents of Kali Yuga. This is the same king. Here he's talking what you would call jihadist language in invaded territory. In a settled territory, when other people are invading it, he is using not jihadist language to fight them off, but Hindu Sanskritic language in order to win the support of one of the most powerful spiritual leaders in that particular region, in his settled dominions. So even a Tipu Sultan, who is often reduced to this binary of freedom fighter against the British or villain who killed lots of Hindus, even he is a highly complex figure. And again, as I said, it's not an either or, it is an and. He was both things. He could be a brutal conqueror who used religion to justify conquest, just as he could be a person who funded Hindu temples, gave land grants to Hindu priests, employed the famous Brahmin Purnaya as his minister. I mean, for a man who was calling for jihad in Kerala, his own minister was a Brahmin. So this is what history is about. History is not about giving you one clear answer. It is about asking you to think more and provoking 10 new questions. It's about making you think, hold on, things were never that simple. Any simplistic narrative is not, frankly, a historically valid argument. Historical arguments are never giving you answers. They're always telling you about the layers that exist. They're always putting the scene in front of you. And that's about it. Our job is not to sit in judgment and say, this was good and that was bad. It was what it was. And we just have to recognize the different layers that existed. So, even when you speak of syncretic, I mentioned how rulers themselves mixed up their identities. Since I mentioned Shivaji Maharaj, let's talk about him also. When he was born, of course, in one of these sultanates. The sultanates of the Deccan were declining. The Mughals had invaded, and he created something new. Now, what's interesting is his family. His family had a long service in these sultanates. And the way he frames and he articulates his kingship in the 1670s, once he's enthroned and he conducts a lot of Sanskritic rituals, is to say that earlier, he doesn't sort of brand all Muslim rulers as bad. He does not say all sultans were evil. He refers to the sultan who was there in his grandfather's time as a dharmatma. He says that was a noble, righteous ruler, so everything was fine. Not only was it fine, his grandfather, his father, used to support that particular sultan. But he then argues that subsequent sultans have not been quite up to the mark. They've not been good, and therefore, Vishnu was reborn on earth in the form of Chhatrapati Shivaji, and he is here to bring back order. And this is, now notice this, he's not from the same dynasty, he's become a king from a completely new family, but he's using the argument that the Nizam Shah, which is the Muslim ruler of Ahmednagar, was a Dharmatma. Subsequent Nizam Shahs were not. Therefore, they lost their right to rule, and he has now come back and reclaimed it. You find the same thing with Tipu Sultan. If you read Caleb's book, and I was stunned when I read it, it's a similar thing where Tipu Sultan does not come from a royal family. His father had just picked up power a generation before. But what he says is previous rulers deserved to rule because they had lived as per righteous norms, and they had God's blessings. Subsequent rulers had lost God's blessings, and God's blessings went to him. Therefore, he took power. Essentially, it's the same political argument being made in a century apart, one by a Muslim king, one by a Hindu king. Even so, when Shivaji, now there are two things to it. Shivaji's own father and uncle, when you say syncretic, think of his own father and uncle. His grandparents did not have children for a very long time. So they went to pray to a holy man, and the holy man blessed them and said, you will have 2 sons. So when they had sons, they named the sons after the holy man. Older son Shahji, the other one Sharifji. Why were they named so? Because the name of that holy man was Shah Sharif. He was a Sufi Muslim. He was a Muslim man that Shivaji's grandparents went to and got their sons, and they named their sons Shahji and Sharifji after a Muslim Sufi. Shahji's son is Shivaji. Shivaji also grew up on the ground in that syncretic sort of culture. The difference is when Shivaji becomes a king, once he is enthroned, kings need a kingly ideology. Kings need a kingly self-image. That is where they draw on previous cultural resources. If you're a Muslim king, you will draw on Quranic principles, you will draw on Persian culture, and you will frame your kingship in those terms. But when Shivaji, being born into a Hindu family, he framed his kingship in Sanskritic terms. So he fell back on classical Sanskrit texts and classical Sanskrit traditions to orchestrate his coronation ceremony, to create his vision of kingship. He referred, in fact, to Hindavi Swaraj. He referred to using Sanskrit as opposed to Persian. That is true, but that is the doing of a king. Kings existed in a different framework as opposed to people on the ground. People on the ground, his own grandparents had no qualms going to a Sufi saint. A king is a different character altogether. The difference is we today, a lot of these boundaries don't exist in a modern democracy, for example. But back in the day, a king's articulation of religion is very different from the masses' articulation of religion. In a village, if there's a holy Sufi, there's a holy Hindu man, people will go to both. There is no difference there. In fact, in Karnataka, there was an article in the Hindu Business Line by Basav Biradar, where he talks about how his own family has links to this hill where there's a shrine to a Muslim Sufi, and how lots of Hindus go there even now in the 21st century in an environment that we say is polarized. On the ground, people still keep up a lot of those practices. So in Shivaji's family too, one generation, you can clearly see the syncretic element. In the political side, once he becomes a king, you see religion articulated with more sharpness, because kings need that. They justify their identity, they project their power through religious vocabulary. That is where that comes in. We should not make the mistake in the 21st century of thinking that what they said needs to be taken at face value and then interpreted to our times. That is where the mistake happens. They were speaking in a specific context for a specific purpose. We are speaking in a different context in a different time. And trying to marry the two is where the politics happens, as it were.
In fact, thank you very much for that. In fact, to sort of push to nudge us to, in a way, situate different events rather than, trying to sort of lift them off and then force feed to sort of, the current day. On that note, I'd like to sort of move to Shivaji again, because you spoke so much about him, which is he appears at the end of your book, Rebel Sultans, which shows how rich the Deccan history was. That said, what are the repercussions of the recent misappropriations of Shivaji, even in the high-grossing films that use the Battle of Sinhagad to show him to be this Hindu leader fighting a Muslim while he was actually fighting Uday Bhan, and his kingdom was in fact one of the first or the earliest to be famous for working for the betterment of subaltern communities. How do we go about undoing such images from public memory and bring back the nuance that you just spoke about?
Part of this was the great irony was in the late 19th century. So in the 1880s, when it was politicians who said, oh, we must resurrect Chhatrapati Shivaji as a cultural icon. Indians were constructing their nationalism at that time. So they were looking for heroes. They were looking for sources of inspiration. And naturally, Shivaji was the biggest inspiration in recent memory and history in Maharashtra. But they actually went to his samadhi, of the fort, which was his capital. And they found that the place was completely in ruins. There was no chhatri. Chhatri is a formal sort of covering over the samadhi. There was no chhatri. Nobody was taking care of it. It was completely run down. And it took decades for them to find enough funding to construct a chhatri. Even the Raja of Kolhapur, who was descended from Shivaji's family, was not willing to give them money to actually keep up Shivaji's samadhi, because he was like, he couldn't really see what these people were doing. Of course, he had his other reasons also. But it's interesting, right, that it took some 30 odd years for a chhatri to be constructed over Shivaji's samadhi, because in that time you could see that, from being in many ways not a contemporary political hero, he became a contemporary political hero. He was sort of brought back to life at that time because it was needed for nationalistic purposes. Which is why from that time you have multiple readings of Chhatrapati Shivaji. So somebody like Jyotiba Phule, who came, who was very much a spokesperson of the marginalized. He was not a Dalit himself, but he spoke for marginalized groups. He was against Brahmanism and caste, etc. One of the things you find with him is he saw his Shivaji, or he interpreted Shivaji as a savior of the weak. He emphasized elements in Shivaji that focused on people on the ground and sort of made that the center point of his argument. Somebody like Tilak, on the other hand, who wanted to galvanize people, he wanted to forget caste, he wanted to galvanize people as Hindus. He saw Shivaji much more in sort of orthodox style as a protector of cows and protector of Brahminical Hinduism and, Brahmins, etc. Because he was trying to construct that kind of Hindu nationalism. So you find that even in the late 19th century, when Chhatrapati Shivaji becomes this, political topic, there is already a split as to how to read him. Now, in reality, as I said, he was all these things. He was not either or. He was not one or the other. He was all these things. Very much when he was, building up his power, of course, he had to draw support from all kinds of people. He employed qazis to give justice in the Islamic style. One of his military comrades and commanders was also a Muslim. When Afzal Khan came to kill Shivaji famously, and Shivaji ended up killing him in return. One of the people who was fighting on Shivaji's side was a Muslim, and Afzal Khan had lots of Marathas on his side who had come to put Shivaji in his place, because these Marathas thought, oh, this boy is becoming too big for his boots, so we need to control him. So they sided with the Muslim villain of the story. So you have that. But once Shivaji becomes a king, yes, Sanskritic classical Hinduism does talk about protecting cows and Brahmins. So you also have that coming from Shivaji's court at the same time. The question is, which one do you emphasize? And that is always a political question. That is not a historical question. As a historian will tell you that these are all true. It is that one gets emphasized over the other. One gets blown out of proportion, and a figure who had different facets to him, who had all kinds of characteristics, who was such a rich individual, is turned into a symbol of one particular detail or one particular element of many elements that were actually part of his life. That is always a political thing. That is not a historical debate. That's why these things happen in film. The other big film that came out was on the Rani of Jhansi, and I found that quite intolerable to watch, because it had taken a woman of such remarkable personality, of such intelligence, and turned her into this outlet for patriotic dialogues. Anything that came out of that particular character's mouth in the movie was patriotism and patriotic dialogue. And there's this one scene where she goes to this man and says, Desh Drohi. And I thought, what a completely unhistorical term even. That was a time when people still thought in terms of their kingdoms and maybe the kingdoms around. The Rani of Jhansi was not thinking about Indian nation and people sitting in Kerala and how they were all part of the same patriotic identity. That did not exist. That was not the way they thought about politics. Which is why 1857, those rulers who had already been toppled from their seats, they fought with the rebels, but the ones who were in their seats actually supported the British. So you have the Sikhs coming to the British aid. You have the Maharaja of Travancore in the south supporting the British. The Nizam in Hyderabad supports the British. None of them join the rebellion, because why should the Nizam care about what is happening up north? Why should the Maharaja of Travancore cause a rebellion in Kerala just because something is happening in central India? They did not make those connections at that time. It was not something that came naturally to them. But film gives us the impression that, oh my God, this is this historical figure, and she was a remarkably intelligent woman. She waited nearly a year before she joined the rebellion, because she was negotiating with the British for the return of her kingdom. Only when she was denied did she finally throw in her lot with the rebels. Before that, she was in negotiations. There's actually a moment where she sort of, denounces the rebels, saying that these people should not have done this. And what is interesting is, in those negotiations, she reveals great sort of intelligent terms of arguing her case, in terms of her awareness of how to go about this legally. She's a very intelligent woman. But here she's given a sword in her hand, and she's shown as this one monochromatic figure who only has patriotic things to say. But that's not the historical element. We may wishfully want her to have been that way. Many of us may feel comfort in imagining that she was that way. But the frank truth is, historically, she was a much more complex person. She was a much more even the men around her. That's where sexism comes in as well, right? It's pretty well known that she in fact gave wise advice to some of the men around her, but they wouldn't take it. They wouldn't listen to her, and that's one of the reasons why they ended up losing. And you can also learn about the consequences of sexism from her. So she's not just about patriotism. She's not just about fighting the British. There were different elements even to her story, as with Shivaji, as with other characters like Tipu Sultan as well. Each character is not what we reduce them to be. Each of them is much, much more complicated. And that is frankly where the richness in those characters resides.
In fact, thank you very much for that answer. I'd like to sort of quickly move, given that you'd raised a point about Travancore not really sort of, supporting or, not supporting the rebellion. I'd like to sort of, move back to your first book, which is a much celebrated book. And in fact, congratulations on Bahubali's producers having adopted it to make a series.
Nothing's happened yet, but yes.
But yeah, let's hope it happens soon. That said, I'd like to revisit, the role played by Colonel John Munro of the East India Company, who had secured the kingdom from premature demise. You go on to say that the future model state, which prided itself on Hindu identity and Brahminical traditions, became hugely indebted to the generosity of a foreign Christian. What do such instances tell about moving away from, conventional animosities that one has while reading history? And can you narrate such instances within the Travancore state?
So, Travancore always advertised itself, especially from the late 19th century, but particularly into the 20th century, towards the 1930s and 40s, very self-consciously advertised itself as a Hindu state of Travancore. That's what they called themselves. And I was very curious to see, how is this Hindu state founded? In the 18th century, it's founded by a warrior who comes pretty much out of a political backwater. Nobody cares about the sliver of territory, which is in Kanyakumari, which is not even in Kerala today. And he came out of that place. In fact, North Kerala kings didn't even think of Travancore as a very Malayali kingdom, And Sardar K.M. Panikkar in a book actually says that Travancore was the victory of Tamilian culture over Malayali culture, because this king came out of Kanyakumari. And how does he construct Travancore? Firstly, he breaks all the existing rules of law and politics of that time. For example, he doesn't just defeat kings and defeat his nobles and put them in place. He actually destroys them. So kingdoms are annexed. Generally, till then, when you defeated a king, the king became your vassal. You did not, he retained autonomy, but he had to pay you tribute. That was the system even the Mughals followed, lots of others. Mughals and Rajputana, for example. He did not do that. He was an annexationist. So first thing is he breaks that law. In his own ancestral dominion, he kills dozens of noble families. And to ensure that these noble families never come back and become a political force, he sells their women into slavery. So those families lose their caste, they become Brashta, so they can never come back as powerful elements in politics. So he first gets that much power in his hands. He kills his cousins also. That's the first moment. So again, conquest, bloodshed. What he then does is starts the annexations. Now for annexations, what do you need? You need an army. So he would get mercenaries from Tamil Nadu. You needed a good commander. The commander happened to be a Dutch prisoner of war who later became a loyalist. So you have one European coming. Who supplies you your arms and sort of firearms? It's the English East India Company. Who's your strategic genius? Who's planning all these things? It's again a Tamil Brahmin. So this Hindu state and the Hindu Malayali state of Travancore is being constructed by a Dutch commander, English arms, Tamil mercenary troops, Muslim and Christian soldiers, partly because, when he had to topple Brahmins, there were these lordly, even ruling Brahmin families. The most famous being the Devanarayanas of Ambalapura. His Hindu soldiers would not fight. They said Brahmin blood is sacred. We will not have the sin of a Brahma Hatya on us. So he carts in Muslims and Christians to do the job. So he gets in, these other elements also. After all this hodgepodge of Europeans and Dutch and English and Muslims and Christians and Tamil Brahmin and Tamil mercenaries and all this, he creates the Hindu state of Travancore. Again, the point I made with Shivaji. Having conquered, he now needs to move from being a conqueror to a king. Because you can be as powerful as you want, but you will not have legitimacy unless you can become a king, unless you are recognized and given that stamp of approval. So what do? You fall back on religion. So he takes the Padmanabha Swami temple, till then a very small, typical, modest temple with a thatched roof, reconstructs it with this magnificent gopuram, carved pillars, and reconstructs the temple. He then dedicates and surrenders all his conquests to the deity. So he says, I am now Padmanabha Dasa, servant of Padmanabha. The kingdom belongs to God, which is a very interesting thing, because what you're basically doing is, till yesterday, people who didn't like you could call you a conqueror. They could call you an invader. They could call you a usurper. They could say that you were not legitimate because older royal families existed. Now they couldn't say it, because now the whole thing belonged to God. So when you criticize the king, you are criticizing God. So which, is a way of cementing power. It's a little bit like today, if you criticize certain people in power, you're branded anti-national, because it's essentially the same thing. There's a tag that gets attached to you. So he uses God there in order to cement his power. Then he creates this huge protocol and ceremoniousness around the family, because the family has to start looking special. Royal families don't descend from the moon. They are actually human beings who construct an aura around themselves, and that aura is very artificially constructed. So even in vocabulary, for example, when a king is addressed, you don't refer to yourself as me or I. You say adiyan, which basically means your slave. When you refer to the king's palace, you don't say house or a palace. You say Bhajanapura, which is basically house of worship, something like that. When the queen is pregnant, you don't say she's pregnant. You say Tiruvayar Vanu, the royal womb is occupied, because queens are semi-divine figures. So their womb is only occupied. It's never pregnant in the conventional way. So there's this huge artificial language. When kings eat, it's called eating nectar, because they don't eat an ordinary food like you and me. They eat nectar. When they go for a bath, it's called Pallinirata, which is not a bath, but a royal frolic in water. So this huge artificial vocabulary is created. It is, in some ways, the public relations of that time. You didn't have newspapers and social media, but by demonstrating your speciality this way, by demonstrating how unique your family was through this augmented ritual, the king was making a political point. Now, what happens, of course, is that for all this, once the company comes in, once there's this attempted invasion by Tipu Sultan, and an old wise king dies, the moment you have a bad egg in power, and this is happening to one of our political parties as well, where lack of leadership sort of is causing all kinds of problems within. It's a similar thing. Suddenly you have a person who's not up to the task of managing, the poor chap is only in his late teens when he becomes king, and he's not good at managing it. So the earlier forces and powers that you had subdued now start reasserting themselves. So you had his Martanda Varma, this king I mentioned earlier, had sort of swathed everything in Brahminical ideas and ideologies. You find the Nayars sort of resisting it and reasserting their power. The Nayar power is what was smashed. So you have the dominant caste trying to reclaim that dominance in a Brahminical state. At the same time, you have the East India Company, which is breathing down the Raja's neck, making him sign all kinds of unfriendly treaties and, threatening annexation and direct management of Travancore if the Raja does not agree. Then the Raja ends up dying, and there's suspicion that he was, done away with poison. And you have female ruler coming. Now the female ruler comes in and she realizes, firstly, company, rivals within, people she doesn't like, ministers she can't control. This is where princely states are interesting. We think that there was again this conflict between them and the Raj, or some people say they were full-on collaborators with the Raj. But no, they also manipulated the British in ways to serve themselves. What does this lady do? She goes to the resident and says, I will make you my all in all in political terms. So you become my minister, you are the one who can control everything. I will completely follow your orders. So long as you get out this minister I don't like, you get out these other people I don't like. There's this rival who's claiming power, get him out of here. So she gets rid of all her internal enemies with the aid of the British, and in return, she concedes a lot of power to the British resident. And the dynamic is fascinating. Is a female ruler who actually comes from a very powerful matrilineal tradition where female rulers have been warriors and fighters. But she actually deliberately plays up this meekness. She plays up this coyness and says, "Oh, I'm a helpless woman. I need your saving." And this Englishman is flattered. He becomes this. He assumes this role of savior, and you can see that she's totally in some ways playing him, and both are gaining from this. He has gained power. He gets actual control over Travancore, and he's the one dictating its policies. She's got rid of all her rivals. She's got rid of all threats to the royal family. So the East India Company and not the state, it's the royal family and the East India Company that forge a compact. The company is not protecting the state. The company is protecting the ruler. The company's treaty is with the ruling family, not with the state. And this then, that's why I said the state at the time, the company itself would have annexed the state. They would have taken the state. But because the Rani played Munro this way, because she played up helplessness, conceded power to him, he did not let annexation happen. He was happy because he had been appointed minister. He was resident as well as minister. So she divided his loyalties. She made him loyal to her in a way and made him her minister, and thereby ensured that he would proactively protect the state. Because if the state got annexed, he had no reason he would lose all his power. He was having a good run in power as her minister. So he wanted to continue that way as well. So you find that he also played it good. So the dynamics are fascinating. It's not, again, a simple element. There is gender here, there is politics here, there is personal dynamics here. There's a resident who's sort of working in some ways against the company's interests because he's been flattered by the queen. There's a queen who's working against some of her own subjects, some of her own politicians, some of her own family members, because she has something to gain from this equation. So it is an alliance that is formed between the company and the queen. So that is why I say that the state was at a time when it could have been annexed. The queen very wisely ensured that the resident came over to her side, and she sort of negotiated with him, and he ended up saving the state. And the state, even before he ended up, saving it at a critical juncture, or helping her save it at a critical juncture. Even before that, that state was never some kind of pristine Hindu country. It was constructed by lots of so-called foreign elements, lots of so-called elements that didn't make it to the official narrative, but they were very much over there.
Thank you, Manu, for that. In fact, I'd like to sort of take you to the fag end of the same, of your book, which is again, the last chapter where you describe the changes in the way of life of the royal family, which in a way gives us a different idea about how people at the helm in princely states did not take to politics. Because in the north you see a lot of people who have joined Indian politics, but then with Travancore it didn't quite happen. So can you talk about the difference in the political history of Kerala, and if there is any role of the communist movement in this?
Oh yes, very much. Because what's interesting is, as I said, this compact between the British and the royal family, not the state, meant that the British were only protecting the family. And they, of course, had times when they were not getting along. But on the ground, there was simmering discontent. In fact, in 1809, there was actually a rebellion against the British led by this very dominant Naya minister. And then, after that, the Nayars were disarmed, and they were the principal fighting community. They were disarmed. But there are other elements that come in as well. One of the elements is missionaries. Because unlike North India, where missionaries penetrated really only towards the end of the 19th century, in the peninsular area of India, South India, they had been around for centuries. And now with the British coming in and formally allowing missionaries into the country, they were able to really come in. Now, the missionaries brought an interesting element to Kerala, which was fighting caste, fighting this kind of injustice. They had their own agenda. They were not doves by any respect, by any yardstick. They were themselves quite political as well. Often they would, for example, play up horrors that they saw on the ground in these pagan countries, not because they were actually horrified, but because if they didn't play up the horrors, they would not get funding from the headquarters. So they had to actually, play up a lot of negative things. So they were also not very positive figures completely. There were positives as well as negatives. But the positive was that they actually taught or informed a lot of marginalized sections of society that you need not be marginalized. You need not take this lying down. You can actually stand up and start asking questions. And that is one of the interesting things because, and this is the other thing generally with South India, but specifically with lots of princely states. When we talk of Indian history, we often talk about British Indian history, areas controlled by the British directly. If you look at the princely states, the freedom struggle is very different over there. It's not really against the British. It's actually a lot of social movements against caste. It is a lot of social movements for caste reform and communal subjects. Those are the things that are happening in the princely states. You have a similar thing in Travancore. The British were too far away. The Maharaja was the political power they saw. The British rule was not direct in Travancore. The politics as it evolved in Travancore was very much a caste and communal issue. And then the missionaries come in, so they educate and start sort of, giving political strength and confidence to marginalized communities. Economy comes in because the colonial economy is connecting the state to a much larger sort of market. As a result of which, for example, the Irava community, which used to be a highly marginalized community, they were, toddy tappers, coir workers. Those were the traditional industries. Now, for example, the coir that you were making for, or the mats and the ropes you were making for your feudal lord, suddenly there was a possibility to sell it in a market. From that market, it would be exported not just to Europe, but even to America, which meant you were getting cash incomes. Cash was a very interesting commodity because using cash, what can you do? You can not only expand your activities, you can buy land, which means what? Land, which is the preserve of the upper castes. Suddenly you find lower caste groups with cash in hand starting to buy this. At the same time, the Syrian Christians in Kerala, who are much older than the missionaries, they've been around for centuries, they are coming into their own and they're coming into business. So you find by the late 19th century, the royal family is stuck in this Brahminical cocoon and they're trying to preserve it against onslaughts by the British. On the ground, you see the Irava community moving from highly marginalized to slowly less marginalized to highly assertive. You have the Nayars who are clearly in a sense of decline because the royal family in this Brahminization, they first took away all the hard power that the Nayars had. The remaining power the Nayars had was related to land. Now they're starting to lose that as well. So the Nayars have their own internal social reform too in order to survive this. So the subcastes go away. They become one sort of unified caste group. That is happening. The Syrian Christians are making their own money through coffee plantations, through business enterprises, etc. So communalism and caste is what becomes the politics of Travancore in this particular time. And that is why the result of all this is that it's only in the 1930s, just on the eve of independence, a decade or so before independence, that the Congress becomes a factor at all, which is again not by coming and establishing a Congress here, but by using these communal parties that already existed and giving them that Congress stamp of approval. Now what happens is, till 1947, the state is officially under that Brahminical thing. But because these pressures are building, what do the Rajas do? First, they start allowing lower caste on all the roads, which lower caste groups were not allowed earlier. Then in 1936, as Iravas, who are a very powerful community now, threaten to convert to Islam and other religions, the Maharaja feels, oh my God, I have a Hindu state. How can I have such a large community leaving? Therefore, he throws open temples. So again, the reform is not because the Raja felt like doing it. It's because he had no option. In many ways, the pressure was mounting. There was no other way than reform. It wasn't a question of if, it was a question of when. And then all this has happened, but it doesn't really make a difference. I mean, suddenly getting access to temples doesn't take your political grievances. So the next big ideology that comes into Kerala, into Travancore. Now, Travancore is getting factories by now. Economic, growth is high. Revenues are very high. The result of this is workers are increasing. So naturally, communism is attracted to workers because they realize, they've had a century of political training now. They've had a century starting with the missionaries, and perhaps even before, if you talk about the way the Naya community lost its power. Starting from them, they have a long political tradition of slowly resisting the state, slowly building up to questioning the state in more and more direct ways, till finally in the Hindu Brahminical state of Travancore, created by a king, in a very Brahminical avatar. It's not even a paler version of that. It is actually the complete opposite in the form of communism that emerges. And the great irony is that in 1809, there was a rebellion against the British. That was the last time previously that blood had flown in Travancore, of the people when they sort of stood up to the Maharaja as well as to the company. After that, the next time there is that kind of armed revolt in Travancore is when the commies stand up to the state, and the Diwan of Travancore sends in machine guns to fire at them just on the eve of independence. Very many people die, but that became this chief highlight in the communist, history of Kerala. And then, of course, once, post-independence or post-colonial Kerala is born, it's so quick that this whole monarchy folds and fades away. Very quickly that whole thing comes collapsing, and within a decade of independence, you have a communist government that's elected in a place where there are two powerful monarchies, Travancore as well as Cochin. in that state where there were these two ultra-orthodox kings who ran very efficient governments, ran very rich states, highly educated people, but you have a communist government, because behind all that, that social turmoil was always there. That, the facade was one thing, the reality was another. And the communists, of course, re-galvanized a lot of this. They actually brought even more force into the welfare model, even more energy into schools, and took it to the next level. So you can actually see that communism didn't emerge out of nowhere. It emerged in a political landscape that was already ripe for something like that, already ripe for something to push it into the next sort of level of agitation and next level of political evolution even at that time.
Thank you, in fact, for that crisp and at the same time articulate,
crisp, I don't know, my answers are very long.
But definitely, I mean, we've just spoken about, almost 100 years of what happened there almost, So on that note, I mean, thank you very much. And I'd like to sort of ask you one last question before we end this, which is to sort of, we've spoken about British figures who I mean, with quote unquote, checkered personalities. I mean, I'd like to sort of ask you a question about, Macaulay, the imperialist we love to hate. That's how you've sort of, you have a passage in your recent book. I mean, can you actually talk about, what his policies did to our freedom movement? Because today we have a blanket, at least in the South, we have there are people who think, who are trying to sort of propagate him as this single, most dangerous person who's basically taken away Indian culture from us. So, I mean, if you could shed some light.
There's, in fact, this every year, at least once, there is this WhatsApp forward that comes, which shows Macaulay's speech in Parliament in London, where he says, "Oh, these Indians have such a great culture. The backbone of their national identity or whatever is their culture. So we must break their culture. Only then can we rule this wonderful country, etc." Firstly, Macaulay, even when criticizing India, would never say wonderful things about Indians, or this is such a wonderful country. The only way we can take it is by this sort of mischievous thing. He would never use that word. The man hated mangoes, for example, which most Indians love. He called mangoes a mix of honey and turpentine in terms of their taste. He didn't think there was anything worthwhile in Indian literature. He was ultra patronizing to Indians in general. But all the same, Macaulay is not the same thing to all people. For example, a few years ago, I think it was perhaps a decade ago, there were a number of Dalit intellectuals who actually installed a goddess somewhere, I think in Uttar Pradesh, I think, called Angrezi Devi. She was actually called Goddess English because Macaulay is the one who made English the official language of the state in India. Till then it was Persian, and the British government was also functioning till the 1830s in the Persian language. And in fact, that's the other big thing, right? Persian was the language used for diplomatic purposes, even in Kerala. Most Malayalis don't know this, but when this king I mentioned, that 16-year-old who ended up, being a bad ruler, I've seen his letters that he wrote to Lord Minto, for example, which are now in the National Library in Scotland. They're all in Persian, because Persian was the language in which you addressed even the British, because it was the language of Mughal diplomacy, and that tradition had been inherited by other rulers in other parts of the country as well. So Macaulay is the one who replaces with English. And English is where finally there is something resembling a level playing field. If you have English, that is a passport to success. That is a passport to employment. It is a passport to social mobility, even today. And forget the 19th century. Even today, why is it that lower middle class parents are anxious that their children should go to English medium schools? Because if you speak English, you speak the language of the world, your horizons are wider, your job opportunities are wider, you can survive. Something or the other will work out. At that time as well, English became a passport to power. A lot of Dalits who were not given access to Sanskrit, who were not given access to local schools, they did get access to missionary schools where they were taught English. Which is why these Dalit intellectuals thought Angrezi Devi. Other Hindus may not care, but Dalits care about Angrezi Devi. So Macaulay and the same group actually celebrates Macaulay's birthday as a Jayanti. So we have Gandhi Jayanti, Nehru Jayanti. Some people have, Savarkar Jayanti. So too, there is a set of people who actually have Macaulay's Jayanti that they celebrate as a good, positive occasion, because for them, that man helped their community move ahead and sort of slowly rise and claim its political rights. Similarly, even if you're looking at Macaulay as a man, speaking of binaries, English or the British Empire equal to bad, Indians and nationalists equal to good. again, that a single, sort of binary reading of things. Slightly more complex. Yes, empire is bad. Imperialism is not a positive, constructive force if you analyze it. But what's interesting is that these characters themselves, these Englishmen on the ground, were not villains who woke up in the morning as villains. They were individuals who sometimes did some very interesting things. For example, in Macaulay's case, he's the one who insisted that the British government's education system in India, till then the British government was sponsoring education of traditional texts. They had assumed that when Indians thought of education, they talk either of Persian education or they talk of Sanskrit education as the Brahmins see it. So they were reading their Manusmritis and their various texts, etc. And Curzon said, no, I'm not going to teach kids. They need to learn geography, not whether the ocean was made of milk and butter and honey and how Vishnu was lying in that ocean. He said, this is not what they need to learn. They need to learn science. They need to learn mathematics. They need to learn modern subjects, as it were. And of course, he had his own intentions. He was not a very pleasant man by all standards, or rather unpleasant, unlikable man. But again, that was an important moment. By insisting that that become the future education policy, he was also making a shift, and that is what led to a class of Indians who were well educated in these modern subjects, who were able to talk back to the West using their own language, quite literally, which was the English language, but also using their conceptual language, a conceptual language of science, a conceptual language of rationality, conceptual language of political rights. It was because they had had access to that kind of education that they were able to even start fighting the British. We didn't start the fight with the British on the streets. We started it first by intellectually arguing against the empire, by intellectually arguing using an idiom already familiar to the British. So when we said we want democracy, first they had to know what democracy was. They had to first understand it in order to deploy it against the same people who taught those principles to them in the first place. So there's this interesting circle that is being done. So there Macaulay is important, or at least interesting. Similarly, other characters also, Lord Curzon is hated for his partition of Bengal. The irony is, of course, the Congress was almost becoming a dying party at that time, the Indian National Congress. It's because he did the partition of Bengal that there was such public anger that the party was able to rejuvenate itself and get back as a meaningful force. So there's, of course, that thing. But Curzon also contributed in other interesting ways which are not very well known. For example, he's the one who invested a lot of money into the Archaeological Survey of India. And Nehru himself said that when all is said and done, it is because of Curzon that our monuments are protected. There's a lamp that hangs in the Taj Mahal over Mumtaz Mahal's tomb, a silver lamp. Curzon commissioned it and brought it all the way from Egypt to hang it there. He's the one who once, he used to go on these tours, and once on one of these tours, he found that the British government had converted one of these Islamic mausoleums into a post office, and he immediately got them to vacate. He said, what? This is a travesty. These monuments are historical structures. We may be the current rulers of India, but this is history. You can't turn it into a post office, and he got those people out. Similarly, there was this one case where in Burma, so not really India of today, but part of the Indian Empire of that time, there were a bunch of English soldiers who went and raped an older Burmese woman who went mad and died. And Curzon discovered that the entire British military establishment had tried to conceal this. And he fought and fought and fought his own government, saying, we claim that we are here to civilize Indians and to teach Indians how to rule. We have to hold ourselves up to those standards. We can't behave like this here. If we're telling them that we are better than you, and then we end up behaving like this, of course they're going to stand up to us. We have to be able to stand up to our principles. He fought the entire establishment. He fought his commander. At the end of it, he couldn't inflict as bad a punishment as he wanted, but he got them sent off to the worst posting he could find with no leave for 2 years. I mean, that was the best he could do in the circumstances. But again, it shows that while he was imperialist, he also in some ways genuinely believed in certain ideals, and held his own countrymen accountable to that as well. Another, Arthur Cotton. I mean, you asked about Macaulay, but I'm going on with these other names.
Oh,
there's this man called Arthur Cotton. And in the early part of the 19th century, when the British were investing in trains, he kept warning them, saying that trains are not what this country needs. Trains are expensive. They're a very long-term investment. People are not going to be able to afford tickets or whatever. It's going to benefit the British system. It's going to benefit the British army. But other than that, it's not going to benefit Indians. And he said what you need to focus on is irrigation and waterways, because this country has so many rivers, etc. Firstly, irrigation means more farmers and more agricultural belts will become prosperous. But the other thing is use the rivers for transportation. You already have that infrastructure. You just have to develop the externalities and certain elements of it, but the flow is still there. So you can use that. Of course, they didn't listen to him. But in the limited domain he had available to him in the Godavari belt, he ended up irrigating that entire place. So to this day, just as I said, there are Dalit intellectuals who celebrate Macaulay's Jayanti, so too every year on Arthur Cotton's birthday, farmers in that area, there's an estimated 2,000 or 3,000 statues, busts, etc., of this man in that part of Andhra-speaking territory. And there you find that even now farmers go out and put garlands on his statues on his birthday, because he is an imperialist. He was also an evangelical imperialist, so very much aware that he was here to civilize Indians and all of that. But because he made a material difference to their lives, he is still almost worshipped by local farmers because he brought them water. He brought them something that no previous ruler had done. So even though they were nationalists, even though they're Indians, they still look up to this particular man. And I heard this story when I went to interview a man called Robin Cotton in London when I was doing my work on my first book. One of the British residents in Travancore was called C.W.E. Cotton. And I went to meet his nephew, Robin Cotton, and he said, "Oh, you're here about, Uncle Charles. I thought you'd be here about Arthur Cotton." And I said, "Who's Arthur Cotton?" And he said, "Oh, this is our more famous ancestor, another, far more impressive great uncle who actually brought water to these people." And it turns out that the then government of Andhra Pradesh had even invited this Robin and his wife to the official state celebration of Arthur Cotton's birthday in that particular region. And this man and his wife actually came all the way to India, participated in that ritual with some very serious senior ministers, venerating this Englishman who was part of the East India Company, and went back to London. So again, even in that colonial thing, even with characters like Macaulay, there are layers. On the whole, is imperialism bad? Of course, it devastated countries. It caused famine, killed millions of people. Most egregiously, it colonized our minds. Even now, when we think about our own past, our own identity, we are thinking through a colonial lens. It's been extremely difficult to get rid of that colonial lens. So colonization is a deeply damaging experience for the countries that were colonized. But all the same, in the process, there were also these interesting other dynamics happening, and all of them have historical value. As I said, the point is not to sit and judge whether this was sort of morally high or morally weak. The point is to know that adds complexity, and complexity is what holds us back from falling on easy answers, from accepting binaries, from accepting what we're told about the past. It teaches us to question and never take anything at face value.
Thank you. In fact, thank you very much for that, Manu. In fact, while you were actually giving me this answer, I was reminded of Professor Sean Rosenberg's paper in the International Political Psychologists Association in Lisbon, where he said, I think if we don't put in the hard work, democracies can easily turn into majoritarian, because you will have populist leaders trying to give us facile answers for complex issues. And in fact, I think, and he said, hard work will only sort of, and the commitment from the citizens is what will sort of take democracy forward. It was actually a provocative paper, but then I'm not sure if I agree with with the tone of it. But then I think something that I draw both from that paper and what you've just spoken is that there needs to be a lot of nuance that we need to harbor while looking at the past, and if we start going on to a judgment spree, then it's a bottomless sink that we'd sort of fall into. Thank you very much for that, Manu, and it was nice talking to you, and I hope this interview and this discussion of ours would be useful to our subscribers. Thank you very much. It's always nice talking to you, and I hope to see you sometime soon in person.
Thanks, Vignesh, and I hope to see you post-COVID either here or in London.
Sure. Thank you.